Silence ruled the upper atmosphere the way it always had, absolute, indifferent, and ancient. 60 miles above the surface of a planet that had no idea what was coming, stars burned without twinkling, and sound had no air to carry it anywhere. It was the kind of silence that had existed since before the first human drew breath, the kind that belonged to deep space and dead moons and the cold stretches between worlds. Then something broke it, not with noise, with light. A streak of white and gold tore across the upper atmosphere like a wound opening in the sky, brilliant and violent, and moving with terrifying purpose. A breath behind it came another streak, this one darker, purple-gray and savage, trailing debris the way a predator trails blood. The two lights spiraled around each other in the thermosphere, not falling the way meteors fell, not drifting the way satellites drifted, but fighting, colliding, separating, colliding again, locked in a conflict so old it had outlasted civilizations and species and entire solar systems. Even here, in the cold silence above a sleeping world, they could not stop. They had never been able to stop. The streaks finally separated. One curved westward and descended toward the American Midwest, trailing a comet tail of superheated air. The other plummeted harder and faster toward the eastern seaboard, leaving a scar of ionized atmosphere behind it like a thunderbolt thrown by something angrier than any god humanity had ever invented. Below on a sleeping Earth, no one saw it yet. At 3:47 in the morning, the Vought International News Operations Center ran on skeleton crew and stale coffee. Most of the 100 monitors in the room cycled through stock tickers, pre-approved celebrity narratives, and rerun footage of the Seven's most photogenic rescues, the kind of content that existed not to inform but to reassure. The three analysts on overnight shift wore the glazed expressions of people paid to stay conscious when every biological instinct was begging them not to. Then every seismic sensor on the eastern grid lit up at the same time. The eruption of data across the monitors was immediate and overwhelming. 12 simultaneous impact signatures across 3 continents, each one registering on the scale of a significant geological event, each one in a location where no geological event had any business occurring. One analyst spun in her chair and called across the room to her colleague, her voice carrying the specific pitch of someone who has just seen something that doesn't fit inside any category she was trained for. Her colleague leaned into his monitor and confirmed what she already feared. These weren't meteors, because meteors didn't change direction mid-descent. These weren't weapons tests, because no nation on Earth had the capability to produce this signature. These were arrivals. The analyst named Carter picked up the emergency phone, the one with a number he had memorized through mandatory training, but had genuinely never expected to dial, and called the penthouse. It rang twice. The line opened without a greeting, just breathing, controlled and immediate, the breathing of someone who had already been awake and watching. Carter delivered the report in a single sentence. Something had fallen from the sky, multiple somethings, and they were moving. The voice on the other end absorbed this information in silence, delivered 2 words of acknowledgement, and disconnected. On every monitor in the operations center, the network feeds cut simultaneously to the same image: a crater in rural Kansas, half a mile wide, glowing faintly blue at its scorched edges, steam rising from the earth in slow columns as though the planet itself was exhaling something it had held too long. At the center of that crater, something enormous was standing up. The sun had not yet fully risen over the cornfields of rural Kansas, but the crater had its own light, a pale, residual luminescence baked into the scorched ground by the heat of re-entry, fading slowly as the minutes passed. The impact had flattened every cornstalk within a quarter-mile in perfectly concentric rings, pressing them into the earth with a precision that looked deliberate rather than catastrophic, as though something had chosen to land here rather than simply fallen. The steam rose in great slow columns. The metal groaned deep, structural sounds like a ship settling after a long voyage. And then the movement began. massive and deliberate and unmistakable. The sound of something assembling itself from a resting configuration into a standing one, joints the size of city buses locking into position, hydraulic systems releasing accumulated pressure in long hissing exhales that stirred the steam around it into slow, enormous spirals. Optimus Prime stood. 6 stories of red and blue metal, ancient and battle-scarred, bearing the damage of a conflict that had begun before most of Earth's current continents existed in their present form. His optics, those deep, luminous eyes the color of a clear afternoon sky, moved slowly across the horizon, reading the landscape with the patience of a being who had spent 3 million years learning to assess unfamiliar terrain. He checked his hands, turned them over. The gesture was almost human, the quiet self-inventory of someone who has survived something they weren't certain they would survive. He opened his communications array and reached out across the frequencies for his team. Static answered him from every direction. He tried again, his voice dropping into the low, careful cadence he used when he needed to project calm he wasn't entirely certain he felt, calling for Bumblebee, for Ironhide, for anyone in range. The wreckage distributed around him told part of the story, pieces of the Ark, debris from the Nemesis, the material evidence of a battle that had begun in low orbit and ended here, in a Kansas cornfield at dawn, with uncertain outcome and unknown cost. A small human sound stopped him mid-transmission. He looked down. A child 9 years old at most, still wearing pajamas, holding a half-eaten granola bar with the casual confidence of someone who had wandered out to investigate a noise and found something that would be the story of her entire life. She stared up at him with enormous eyes that held fascination rather than terror, which told Optimus something important about human children that he filed carefully away. She asked him the oldest question in the universe, good guy or bad guy, with the directness that only children and honest soldiers ever managed. Optimus looked at her for a long moment, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was never as simple as it sounded, and he had learned that lesson the hardest possible way across centuries of conflict. He told her he was trying to be the former, and that he had been trying for a very long time. She nodded as though this was a satisfactory answer, and pointed him toward the farmhouse behind her, where through a kitchen window the blue glow of a television screen was visible, and his own catastrophic arrival was already international news. And on that screen, in footage captured by a news helicopter hovering at a cautious distance from a second crater site, this one in Newark, New Jersey, where the surrounding buildings had not merely collapsed but simply ceased to exist, something darker than him was emerging from the earth. Ashley Barrett had aged 4 years in 2 hours, and she knew it, because she had looked at herself in the bathroom mirror at 5 a.m. and seen the evidence clearly. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office with cold coffee and watched the sunrise over New York City with the expression of a woman whose entire professional existence was balanced on a ledge she hadn't built and couldn't see the bottom of. The Department of Defense called and she silenced it. The president called and she silenced that too, because there was no version of those conversations that ended with her having more control than she did right now, and right now she had almost none. The door opened without a knock. She had been expecting that. Homelander walked into the room the way he always did, with the absolute physical assurance of someone who had never once in his life been in a space that didn't belong to him, and stopped beside her at the window. For a moment they both simply looked at the city below, which was beginning to wake up to the news in the way cities always woke up to catastrophe, slowly, then all at once. He wanted to know what those things were. Not analysis, not preliminary reports, not Vaught's messaging framework. What they were, in the way that Homelander had always needed to understand things, which was immediately and completely and in terms that placed him at the center of the situation. He told her he had flown over the Kansas site before coming here. He had gotten close. And whatever was standing in that crater was the size of a skyscraper, and when he had gotten within range, It had turned its enormous head and looked at him, not with aggression, not with fear, but with a calm, careful assessment that Homelander had experienced from almost no one in his entire life. He had left. He hadn't announced it as a retreat, hadn't framed it that way even internally, but he had turned around and flown back to Manhattan and come directly here. And the question underneath all his other questions was one he didn't ask out loud because Homelander did not ask that question. Ever. Ashley gave him the plan, controlled messaging, Vought-monitored event. The Seven as Earth's response force, humanity's champions, the familiar reassurance that the world had been buying for decades. She would make it about him, the way everything was always made about him, the way that had always worked before. He absorbed this and asked what happened if they were hostile. She told he would stop them. He was quiet for a long moment before asking the question she had been dreading since 3 a.m. The question that lived underneath all of Homelander's carefully maintained performance of invincibility like groundwater under stone. She didn't answer it, because every answer she could construct ended badly, and she had learned, over years of managing the unmanageable, that some questions were safer left floating in the air than brought down to earth and examined. The Newark crash site looked like a punishment rather than an accident. Where the Kansas crater had the quality of arrival, something powerful choosing to land somewhere. The Newark site had the quality of impact, of force applied without any particular concern for what it landed on. The buildings within 3 blocks were simply absent, reduced below foundation level, their materials scattered across a half-mile radius. What remained standing did so at wrong angles, facades stripped, windows gone, structural integrity a memory. Megatron came out of the earth the way inevitability comes, not fast, not dramatic, but with the absolute certainty of something that was always going to happen. His silver-gray architecture was built entirely for intimidation, every design choice a statement about the relationship between power and beauty, which was that beauty was irrelevant. His red eyes moved across the ruined industrial block with the precise, unhurried attention of a general conducting a site assessment. He processed the planet in the way he processed every new environment, as a system to be understood and then leveraged. The infrastructure was primitive. The dominant species was fragile. The political structures were, from the initial data available to him, exactly the kind of complicated and compromised arrangement that created exploitable fracture lines. He had conquered 17 worlds. He recognized the architecture of a conquerable one. His attention snagged on something. On a cracked concrete wall across the rubble field, someone had spray-painted a corporate logo before fleeing the clean, confident V of Vought International, and beneath it in smaller letters, the slogan that had been running on American airwaves for the better part of 2 decades. We keep you safe. Megatron looked at it for a long time. He traced the outline of the V with one enormous finger, the gesture almost contemplative, the way a strategist traces lines on a map before committing to a campaign. A corporation that had built its entire business model around selling the idea of protection to an entire species, that had manufactured heroes the way other industries manufactured product, that had turned human fear into quarterly revenue and called it heroism. He had worked with worse raw material on worse worlds, and won anyway. An automated Vought emergency broadcast reached him through the hijacked local frequencies. The looping, confident assurance that everything was under control, that the Seven were responding, that humanity was protected and safe and held. Megatron listened to the entire broadcast without moving. Then he laughed, low and genuine, the laugh of someone who has just been handed a gift they didn't expect but immediately recognized the value of. He didn't need to build a propaganda apparatus. They had already built one for him. In a Brooklyn safe house that smelled like instant noodles and controlled anxiety, Billy Butcher sat at the kitchen table in front of a jury-rigged monitor setup, carrying 4 simultaneous news feeds, and said nothing for a very long time. The footage cycling across his screens was the kind of footage that broke the brain's ability to generate appropriate responses. Kansas, Newark, coastal Germany, something off the Japanese coast, enormous shapes moving through smoke and debris with the unhurried confidence of things that had never needed to worry about what came at them next. He said it out loud finally, with the flat affect of a man whose capacity for surprise had been surgically removed by his particular life experience. Giant robots. Actual, genuine, walking, city-flattening giant bloody robots. Huey confirmed this assessment with the pained accuracy of someone who had gotten used to confirming Butcher's most absurd suspicions. Mother's Milk hung up the phone and reported that the doodah had gone dark and Vought was already running interference across every major network, which surprised no one in the room. Kimiko signed something rapidly to Frenchie, who translated. The one in Kansas had been helping, pulling a family from a collapsed structure. Carefully, gently, like it was trying not to break anything else. The room sat with that information for a moment. Huey floated the possibility that one of them might actually be good, and Butcher responded with the specific weariness of a man who had spent years learning that good and powerful were two categories that almost never shared occupants, and when something presented itself as an exception to that rule, the smart move was to wait and see. Then the monitor behind him cut to a new feed. Breaking news, aerial footage, live. A white-and-red speck descending from the morning sky toward the Kansas crater, moving with the particular deliberate slowness of someone who wanted to be seen making an approach. Everyone in the room went still. Because they all knew what that white-and-red speck was, and they all knew what his presence at that site meant, and not a single one of them could identify a version of what happened next that didn't make everything significantly worse. The Kansas morning had settled into a fragile golden quiet. Steam still rose from the crater's edges in lazy columns, and the birds, impossibly optimistic, as birds always were, had begun returning to the tree lines at the field's perimeter. The girl in the pajamas had retreated to a safe distance, but had not, under any circumstances, gone inside. Some things you stayed to watch even when you knew you probably shouldn't. Optimus heard Homelander before he saw him, a sharp crack of displaced air, precise and purposeful, the sound of something moving fast choosing to slow down for effect. His optics tracked upward and found the figure descending from the sky with studied deliberateness, hovering finally at eye level, 40 feet off the ground, cape hanging still in the windless morning air like a flag over occupied territory. The jaw was set. The eyes were scanning, chest plate, optics, scale, the structural damage still visible from re-entry, running the calculations that powerful beings always ran when they encountered something that might be more powerful than them. Optimus looked at him and understood him immediately. Not his specific history, not the particular architecture of his psychology, but the type. He had encountered this configuration of being on a dozen worlds across 3 million years, power that had never been checked by anything powerful enough to check it, strength that had become so total that it had lost the ability to imagine its own limit. He had watched it destroy civilizations. He had, in his worst moments, seen traces of it in himself. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Neither of them spoke. The news helicopter 50 meters away hovered at a distance calculated to be beyond blast radius but within camera range, transmitting live to 400 million screens simultaneously. The girl in the pajamas looked between them with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who understood the situation better than most of the people watching it on television. When Homelander spoke, he spoke quietly enough that the cameras couldn't carry it, a private declaration wrapped in the cadence of absolute certainty. He said this was his planet. 3 words, delivered the way he delivered everything, as established fact rather than arguable claim. Optimus was quiet for a moment. His optics dimmed slightly, not in submission, not in preparation for conflict, but in something that moved across his face, the way grief moved across the faces of beings who had seen enough to know what was coming and couldn't stop it. He had heard this sentence before. He had heard it on Cybertron before everything broke, heard versions of it on every world where the same pattern repeated itself. The powerful claiming ownership of the vulnerable, framing dominion as protection, calling control by the name of love. When he answered, his voice was low and carried anyway, the way the voices of certain beings carry regardless of volume, filling the available space not through force but through weight. He told Homelander that no planet belonged to any one being, and that this was a lesson he had spent 3 million years learning the most painful way available, and then spent the remainder of that time trying to teach to anyone willing to listen. Homelander's eyes began to glow red. Optimus Prime did not flinch. And somewhere in Newark, watching the same footage on a hijacked emergency broadcast screen propped against the rubble of a building that no longer existed, Megatron watched the two of them stare each other down and felt something that, in a creature built entirely from war, passed for delight. The helicopter footage was being watched by 400 million people simultaneously, and not one of them made a sound that mattered. Across living rooms and phone screens and newsroom monitors, humanity held its collective breath in the way it only did when something was happening that it fundamentally did not have the language for yet. Anchors on every major network had stopped talking. Not because they had been told to stop, but because there was nothing in any broadcast journalism training program that had prepared anyone for the image currently filling every screen on Earth. A man floating 40 feet above a Kansas cornfield, glowing red-eyed and furious, staring into the face of something 6 stories tall that was staring back at him with the patience of deep time. Homelander had expected the thing to react. That was the fundamental architecture of every interaction he had ever had with anything powerful, he projected, and the other thing reacted, and the nature of its reaction confirmed the hierarchy. Fear confirmed it one way. Aggression confirmed it another. Even defiance confirmed it, because defiance was still a response, still an acknowledgement that he was the thing being responded to. In 30-plus years of being the most powerful entity on the planet, he had never once encountered something that simply looked at him the way Optimus Prime was looking at him now. Not with fear, not with aggression, not with the performative calm of someone suppressing fear or aggression, with genuine, unhurried assessment. The way an old soldier looks at a young one, not dismissively, but with the particular sorrow of someone who recognizes a pattern they have seen before and knows how it ends. Homelander felt something shift in the architecture of the moment and did not like what was shifting or which direction it was moving. He told the machine that it didn't understand how things worked here, that this planet had a structure, an order, a hierarchy that had been established and maintained, and that he sat at the top of, and that whatever this thing was and wherever it had come from, it was now inside that structure whether it chose to acknowledge it or not. He said it with the voice he used for press conferences and rescue operations, and all the other performances of benevolence that Vought's PR team had spent decades perfecting, warm, assured, carrying beneath the warmth the unmistakable frequency of a threat. Optimus looked at him for a long, quiet moment. When he spoke, his voice carried no performance in it at all, no warmth deployed as weapon, no threat wearing the costume of reassurance. Just words, delivered with the weight of something that had been true long enough to stop needing decoration. Freedom, he said, was the right of all sentient beings. Not a rebuttal, not a counterargument. A principle, stated the way principles were stated by those who had paid for them in full. 400 million people heard it through helicopter microphones and broadcast feeds, and the sentence landed differently in different places, as provocation in Vought boardrooms, as revelation in living rooms where people had spent years watching Homelander smile on television and feeling a low-grade unease they couldn't name. Homelander heard it and understood, for the first time in a very long time, that he was talking to something that could not be manipulated. not because it was too stupid to be manipulated, but because the architecture of manipulation, flattery, fear, the leveraging of ego, required a target with needs that could be exploited. And this ancient machine standing in a Kansas cornfield had spent 3 million years burning those needs out of itself, one costly lesson at a time. There was nothing to grab onto, no vanity to stroke, no insecurity to press, no hunger to promise satisfaction to. The ground beneath Homelander's particular kind of power was leverage, and Optimus Prime offered him none. He flew away without another word. It was not the kind of departure that felt like a choice. The emergency board meeting convened at Vought Tower by 9 a.m., which in corporate terms was essentially instantaneous, and communicated the depth of the crisis more clearly than anything said inside it. Ashley Barrett sat at the head of the table with the controlled expression of someone who had decided that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford and had locked it in a drawer to deal with later. Around her, the senior leadership of the most powerful media and superhero corporation in the world looked at each other with the specific anxiety of people whose entire business model had just been complicated by the arrival of beings that their business model had no framework for. The proposal that emerged from 3 hours of argument and counterargument was characteristically Vought in its essential logic. If you can't control something, partner with it until you can. A diplomatic delegation, official contact. The framing would be first contact between Earth's protectors and the new arrivals, Vought positioned as the responsible intermediary between humanity and the unknown, the Seven as the welcoming committee for a planet that was, the company would emphasize, already well protected and well managed. It was, Ashley acknowledged privately, the kind of plan that sounded reasonable until you thought about it carefully, at which point it revealed itself as an attempt to put a corporate logo on something that would destroy the logo and everything attached to it without particular effort. She sent the delegation anyway, because the alternative was admitting that Vought had no viable response, and that was a S. Intense that could not be spoken in a Vought boardroom or anywhere near one. The delegation reached the Kansas crater by early afternoon. 3 executives, 2 lawyers, a PR specialist, and a military liaison who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on the planet. They approached Optimus Prime with the careful, upright posture of people who deal regularly in power, but are currently in the presence of something that makes their regular power feel like a rounding error. The lead executive opened with Vaught's standard first contact framework, which had been developed for scenarios involving rogue SUPs and hostile foreign governments, and had never been intended for this, but was all they had. He spoke about mutual benefit, about Earth's existing protective infrastructure, about the value of established relationships, and the importance of stable partnership frameworks going forward. Optimus listened to all of it. When the executive finished, Optimus asked him a single question, a quiet, specific, unhurried question about a particular Vought facility in Nevada, and the compound 7 miles northeast of it, and the activities that had been conducted in that compound over the previous 11 years. The executive's face changed color in a way that faces rarely changed color in boardrooms. Optimus had been on Earth for approximately 14 hours. In that time, while the humans around him were processing the spectacle of his arrival, he had been doing what he had spent 3 million years learning to do, gathering intelligence, cross-referencing data, understanding the system he had landed inside. He knew about the Compound V trials. He knew about the children. He knew about the cover-ups, the suppressed studies, the deaths that had been reclassified, the regulatory frameworks that had been quietly defunded. He had accessed nothing classified he hadn't needed to. The information existed in fragments across public records, financial disclosures, insurance filings, and the digital noise of a corporation that had been lying at scale for long enough that the lies had become structurally load-bearing, impossible to remove without bringing down everything built on top of them. He laid it out without accusation in his voice, without theater, without the prosecutorial energy of someone building toward a dramatic reveal. He simply stated what he had found, clearly and in sequence, the way a soldier files an after-action report. The delegation stood in a Kansas cornfield in their good suits and listened to an ancient alien machine describe the crimes of their employer with the calm authority of someone who intended to remember all of it. They left without completing the diplomatic framework. Annie January had driven herself to Kansas, which her Vought security detail had attempted to prevent, and then attempted to accompany her on before she made clear, with a precision that surprised them, that she would be going alone. She arrived at the crater's perimeter in the late afternoon, after the delegation had left and the news helicopters had pulled back to refuel, when the field was quiet in the particular way things go quiet after a long day of being observed. She stood at the edge of the crater and looked up at Optimus Prime, and did not perform anything. No starlight smile, no brand-appropriate expression of measured concern. Just Annie, tired and angry, and carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has been pretending that the system she lives inside is salvageable for longer than the evidence supports. She told him she'd heard what he said to the Vought delegation. Word had gotten back, word always got back, and she needed him to know that not everyone inside the structure was defending it, that some of them were trying to dismantle it from within, which she understood sounded exactly like the kind of thing someone defending it would say, and she was prepared for him not to believe her. Optimus looked at her for a long moment. He had seen, across 3 million years and 17 worlds, the particular position she was describing, the person of conscience inside the corrupt institution, too embedded to leave cleanly, too honest to perform loyalty comfortably. He had watched those people burn themselves up in the friction between what they knew and what they were allowed to say. He did not tell her what he had watched happen to them. Instead, he asked her what she needed, and then he listened to the answer with the complete, unhurried attention of someone for whom listening was a strategic act rather than a social courtesy. By the time she left the crater, she had given him 3 things: a list of Vought black sites that didn't appear in any public record, a frequency that would reach Huey Campbell's phone, and something she hadn't expected to give anyone that day, which was a small amount of genuine hope. Butcher received the phone call from Huey, who had received the frequency from Annie, who W. as now technically committing corporate treason at a level that made her previous corporate treason look like a scheduling conflict. He sat with it for a long time, turning the information over in the way he turned everything over, looking for the angle, the hook, the way this would eventually be used against someone he cared about. The conversation in the safe house that followed was the most complicated they had managed in recent memory, which given their recent memory was saying something substantial. Mother's Milk laid it out practically. The Autobot leader had independently documented Vought's crimes after 14 hours on the planet, had access to communications infrastructure that made their own surveillance operations look like a child's science project, and appeared to operate according to a moral framework that was both coherent and consistent, which put him ahead of roughly 90% of the powered beings they had encountered in their careers. Frenchie made the argument that the enemy of a terrible thing was not automatically a good thing, but that in operational terms, the distinction mattered less than the question of alignment. Kimiko signed something that Frenchie translated with the careful accuracy of someone who knew the translation was going to end the debate. She said that the machine in Kansas had gentle hands, and that in her experience, beings with gentle hands and the power to have any other kind of hands were extraordinarily rare and worth paying attention to. Butcher looked at the frequency written on the piece of paper Huey had handed him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he told Huey to make the call. While the Autobots were building bridges, Megatron was building something else entirely. He had spent his day in Newark conducting the kind of research that suited his particular methodology, not accessing public records, but watching. The city moved around his position in a wide, fearful arc, which gave him a clear operational radius and an unobstructed view of the human social dynamics playing out at its edges. News crews at maximum safe distance. Law enforcement establishing a perimeter they had no ability to enforce. And beyond the perimeter, drawn by the footage cycling on every screen in the country, a different kind of visitor. The first one arrived mid-morning. He introduced himself as Soldier Boy, and he had the physical confidence of someone who had never been told no by anything with a pulse, and the specific resentment of someone who had recently been told no by something without one. He stood at the crater's edge and looked up at Megatron and did not run, which Megatron cataloged as either courage or stupidity and assigned provisional credit for. Soldier Boy explained, with the directness of a man whose emotional processing existed primarily as aggression, that he had a problem. The problem was named Homelander. Homelander had a problem named Optimus Prime, and it seemed to Soldier Boy, surveying the available landscape of power and opportunity, that the machine standing in front of him had interests that might align with his own in ways that could be mutually beneficial. Megatron listened to this with the patient attention of someone who has heard every variation of this speech on every world where ambition outpaces judgment, which is all of them. He understood what Soldier Boy was and what he wanted and what he could be used for. He also understood, with the longer strategic vision that distinguished him from the beings he conquered, that Soldier Boy was a prototype. The first inquiry, the proof of concept, the demonstration that the category existed. He made inquiries. The Vought infrastructure, leaking data from a dozen directions simultaneously, provided the rest. There were others, unstable, resentful, compromised subs who had been managed and monetized and controlled, and were sitting on the specific combination of power and fury that, given the right catalyst and the right promise, became something operationally very useful. He found 6 of them in the first day. He promised each of them the same thing, not loyalty, not protection, not the corporate arrangement they had been living inside for years. He promised them relevance. He promised them that the hierarchy they had been chafing against was about to be restructured from the outside, and that the beings present at the restructuring would have choices unavailable to everyone else. He promised them power over the thing they most wanted power over. Every one of them said yes. People always said yes to that on every world. It was the most reliable constant in the universe. The military base in rural Virginia had been operational for 40 years without incident, which was the kind of statistic that tended to make people comfortable in ways that left them unprepared for the end of the statistic. Nobody at the base had been told what was coming, because nobody in the relevant chain of command had believed it was coming, because the relevant chain of command had spent 48 hours receiving Vaught's messaging about the situation being managed, and had found it easier to believe that than the alternative. The base's perimeter sensors registered an anomaly at 11:47 p.m. By 11:48, the perimeter sensors no longer existed. Blackout, unstable, bitter, recently recruited, newly certain of his relevance, moved through the base in 4 minutes. His ability to generate localized electromagnetic pulses had, for the entirety of his Vought career, been managed as a liability. Too destructive, too imprecise, too difficult to monetize within the clean heroism framework that sold advertising. Vought had spent years containing him. Megatron had spent 20 minutes explaining to him that containment was a choice made by those who feared what he could do, and that fear was not a reason to accept limitation. He accepted no limitation. The footage reached every news channel simultaneously, captured by a drone that survived only because it was at the outer edge of the affected radius when the first pulse hit. 4 minutes of footage. A military installation reduced to dark silence, every system dead, every light gone, the base's entire operational capacity eliminated as a demonstration of a point that Megatron had been quite precise about when he briefed his new recruit. The point was not the base. The base was irrelevant. The point was what the footage would communicate to every government, every military, every corporate boardroom, and every living room on Earth when it ran on continuous loop through the night. The point was that the beings currently on this planet were not the category of thing that humanity had been managing and monetizing and watching perform rescues for the cameras. They were not sups. They were not enhanced humans with brand deals and action figures and VOD-approved backstories. They were weapons of war, ancient and practiced and operating according to objectives that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or public approval ratings. Anchors who had spent 2 days carefully deploying the word extraordinary and the phrase unprecedented event looked at the footage and ran out of the language they had been using. The footage didn't need language. It communicated in the universal vocabulary of consequence. Here is what this is capable of. Here is what it chose to do with that capability. Here is the distance between those two facts and the world you were living in yesterday. 400 million people had watched Optimus Prime face down Homelander in a Kansas cornfield and found themselves uncertain what they were watching. The same 400 million people, and then some, watched the Virginia footage loop through the night and understood precisely what they were watching. These were not superheroes. These were weapons of war. And they had chosen sides. There is a particular kind of desperation that only institutions feel, not the raw, animal desperation of a person cornered, but something colder and more deliberate, the desperation of a system that has identified a threat to its own continuity and begun doing the math on what it is willing to sacrifice to survive. Vought International had been doing that math for 72 hours, and the answer it kept arriving at was the same answer it always arrived at when the numbers got uncomfortable enough. More, bigger, faster. Whatever the problem was, the solution was more of what Vought already did, scaled past the point that ethics could follow. The emergency research directive came from the 14th floor at 4 a.m. on the third day, signed by Ashley Barrett with the signature of someone who understood exactly what she was authorizing and had decided that understanding was a problem for later. The directive was 3 pages. The relevant sentence was in the second paragraph. All available Compound V research was to be immediately cross-referenced with the structural and biological data recovered from both crash sites, and a viable synthesis protocol was to be developed within 96 hours. The scientists who received it read that sentence twice. Then they went to work, because Vought scientists had learned, over many years of receiving directives from the 14th floor, that the questions you didn't ask were the ones that kept you employed. The underlying logic was Vaught's most fundamental and most catastrophically consistent one. If a thing exists and cannot be owned, the correct response is to build a version of it that can be. The Transformers were beyond control. Therefore, Vought would create something that occupied the same category in the public imagination while remaining inside the corporate architecture. Cyber-enhanced SUPs. The marriage of Compound V's proven biological framework with whatever Cybertronian technology the recovery teams had been able to extract from the crash site debris. The press relay. AS was already being drafted in the communications department, while the first test subjects were being selected in the sub-basement labs, because at Vought, the announcement always preceded the achievement by design. The sub-basement research facility beneath Vought Tower had been built for exactly this kind of work, insulated from oversight, insulated from sound, insulated from the kind of scrutiny that made certain categories of research impossible to conduct in the open air. The team assembled there within 18 hours of the directive was the best Vought could field, which meant brilliant people who had made specific compromises that had led them to a room like this, doing work like this, at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. The Cybertronian material was unlike anything in their existing framework. It wasn't inert in the way recovered extraterrestrial samples were usually inert. It had a residual energetic quality that the instruments measured but couldn't categorize, something between radiation and electricity, and neither. It interacted with biological tissue, in ways that the preliminary data suggested were transformative, which was the word the lead researcher used in her notes, choosing it carefully because the alternative words were worse. The interaction between Cybertronian alloy fragments and compound V-saturated tissue produced changes at the cellular level that the available microscopy could document but not fully explain, structures forming that had no biological precedent. The body attempting to incorporate something that the 3 billion years of terrestrial evolution had provided no template for incorporating. The first test subject lasted 4 hours. He was a Vought-contracted supe with mid-tier abilities, and a contract clause that the legal team had spent considerable effort making airtight, and he went into the procedure with the specific bravado of someone who had been told the risk profile was manageable, and had chosen to believe this because the compensation package was significant. The changes began within 40 minutes and progressed through stages that the research team documented with scientific precision, and in several cases, visible distress. By the 4th hour, what had been a person was no longer classifiable as one by any working biological definition, and the research team lead made the call that needed to be made, and then sat outside the facility for 11 minutes before going back in. The second subject lasted 6 hours, which the team logged as progress because in this work, 6 was more than 4 and more was always being reframed as better. The third lasted 9. The fourth lasted long enough that the team began to believe, with the specific dangerous optimism of researchers who have been awake for 30 hours and need something to believe in, that they were approaching a viable threshold. The fourth subject died at the 11-hour mark in a manner that the documentation described as catastrophic systemic failure, and that the 3 researchers who witnessed it would not discuss for the remainder of their careers. The 5th subject survived. He was not what they had intended to create. The protocol had aimed for a supe with enhanced structural integrity and limited mechanical augmentation, something that could be shown in a press conference, something with a face that photographed well and abilities that could be demonstrated without causing property damage above a certain dollar value. What they got was something that sat in the containment cell and looked at the researchers through the observation glass with eyes that had changed color twice since the procedure ended, and didn't seem to register pain signals through any monitoring system they could connect to it, and occasionally made sounds at frequencies that the equipment measured, but that the human ear processed as deeply wrong without being able to specify why. Ashley Barrett was shown footage of Subject 5 on the morning of the 4th day. She watched it for 90 seconds. She asked one question, whether it was controllable. The lead researcher gave her an answer that was technically a yes and functionally a maybe, and honestly closer to we don't know yet but we're not going to say that. And Ashley nodded once and told them to continue and left the room and did not look at the footage again. While the scientists worked in the sub-basement, Starscream was working 3 floors above them, in the executive conference suite, wearing the collaborative goodwill of an ally the way a con artist wears a borrowed suit, convincingly, temporarily, and with complete awareness of when it would need to come off. He had arrived at Vought Tower through channels that Megatron had established with the specific patience of a strategist who understood that the most durable infiltrations were the ones the target believed they had initiated. The approach had been structured to feel like diplomacy, a Decepticon envoy, presenting ITSI. LF as independent from Megatron's primary operations, offering intelligence on Autobot movements, and a framework for mutual protection against the threat that both Vought and the Decepticons faced from Optimus Prime's increasingly documented investigation into corporate malfeasance. The framing was elegant. It was also entirely constructed. Starscream understood executives. He had, across centuries of service to Megatron and several attempted coups against him, developed a comprehensive working knowledge of the psychology of the powerful and insecure beings who had significant authority within a defined system, and were therefore terrified of anything that operated outside that system. Vaught's senior leadership presented as this type in concentrated form. They were accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any negotiation, and the 72 hours since the crash had been spent in the continuous low-grade humiliation of discovering that they were not, and the psychic whiplash of that discovery made them, if you understood the mechanism, extremely easy to steer. He offered them three things across three separate meetings, each calibrated to the specific fears of the executive receiving it. To the chief science officer, he offered technical data on Cybertronian biological interface protocols that would, he implied, substantially accelerate the subbasement research program. The data was real. It was also incomplete in ways that would not become apparent until the incompleteness became catastrophic, which was not Starscream's problem. To the chief legal officer, he offered documentation that positioned Vaught's Transformer Engagement Program as operating under a defensible liability framework, which was the kind of legal fiction that corporate attorneys built entire careers on, and which would not survive contact with an actual courtroom. To the chief operating officer, whose particular anxiety Starscream had correctly identified as the fear of being replaced, he offered continued relevance. He implied, with the silky indirection of someone who had practiced this particular manipulation for centuries, that when the current global situation resolved itself, the beings who had been useful partners to the winning side would find their positions considerably more secure than those who hadn't. The COO approved every resource request Starscream submitted for the following 2 weeks without reading them. Megatron, monitoring all three meetings through Starscream's transmission feed, had the same response to Starscream's operational elegance that he always had. He was useful, he was brilliant, and he would need to be watched carefully for the rest of his operational existence, which Megatron intended to ensure was long enough to be valuable and terminated before it became a problem. The information came through 3 intermediaries, which was 2 more than Butcher preferred, but 1 fewer than the situation probably warranted, arriving finally on a Tuesday morning as an encrypted file transfer from a source inside Vaught's research division who had decided, after 11 hours in a room with Subject 5, that there were things more frightening than corporate retaliation. Butcher read the file once quickly and then went and stood at the window of the safe house for a long time. Then he read it again slowly. Then he called the others in. The file contained the subbasement research documentation, which was horrific in the specific, clinical way that institutional atrocities were always documented. Precisely measured, accurately recorded, stripped of the language that would have made the reader feel the weight of what they were reading. But the file contained something else, embedded in the data architecture in a way that the Vought researcher had clearly discovered accidentally and included, because she understood enough about what she was looking at to know that someone else needed to see it. It was a signal analysis, a pattern embedded in the Cybertronian material being used in the subbasement experiments, not passive, not residual, but active, broadcasting, transmitting data about the experiments, about the facility, about everything Vaught's scientists had learned about the interaction between Cybertronian technology and biological matter, at frequencies and through channels that the Vought equipment could not detect, because the equipment had not been built to detect transmissions meant for Cybertronian receivers. Megatron wasn't waiting to find out what Vought would create in that lab. He already knew. He had always known. He had positioned those material fragments in the debris field deliberately, in locations where Vaught's recovery teams would find them, with the specific knowledge of what a corporation operating in desperation would do with recovered alien technology. The experiments in the subbasement were not an obstacle to Megatron's plans. They were a component of them. Butcher sat with this for a long time. Then he went deeper into the file, following the embedded signal analysis backward through its data chain to its origin architecture, which was the part that made the room go quiet when he laid it out for the others. Megatron didn't want Earth. He had never wanted Earth. Earth was a planet with significant resources and a fragile dominant species, and no strategic value that couldn't be found somewhere easier. What Megatron wanted was what he had always wanted across 3 million years of war: Cybertron. A reborn Cybertron, fully energized, restored to the capacity it had before the war consumed it. And the specific energy signature of the process he intended to use for that restoration required a quantity of organic biological material that Earth's population represented in precisely adequate measure, not as subjects, not as a workforce, as fuel. The math was in the file: cold, precise, optimized. The entire experiment in the subbasement was data collection for an energy conversion protocol that had never been tested at full scale. Vaught's scientists were running trials that Megatron's engineers would use to finalize calculations. The file included a timeline. Mother's Milk looked at it and set it down and picked it up again. Frenchie translated it for Kimiko, who read it twice and then looked at no one. Huey said something that he would not repeat afterward. Butcher looked at the timeline for a long time at the date at the end of it and then made 2 calls. One to Optimus Prime's comm frequency through the relay Annie had established. One to a number he hadn't dialed in years, belonging to a person he didn't like and didn't trust and needed immediately. The United Nations emergency session had been called for 9 a.m., which was the geopolitical equivalent of screaming, the formal international architecture scrambling to assert relevance in a situation that had been operating outside any framework the architecture was designed for. 7 heads of state participated in person. 11 more via secure video link. The Secretary General opened the session with the measured, careful language of someone trying to establish procedural normalcy inside a situation that had categorically abandoned normalcy. And the room listened with the specific attentiveness of people who have run out of better options. At 9:14 a.m. the feed died. Not interrupted, not hacked in the conventional sense. Died: every screen, every projector, every communication device in the chamber going simultaneously and completely dark, replaced after 4 seconds of absolute black by a single image. Megatron, full frame, standing in what image analysis would later confirm was the destroyed Newark Industrial District, deliberately chosen as a staging ground because its devastation was visible in the background, and that visibility was the point. The broadcast reached every screen simultaneously, not just the UN chamber. Every television, every phone, every monitor displaying any kind of signal anywhere on the planet received it at the same moment, in every language, with the crisp technical quality of a transmission that had been prepared with care. Megatron had spent 3 days on Earth and had already mastered its global communications infrastructure, with the thoroughness of someone who had conquered enough worlds to know that communications control preceded all other control. He spoke for 4 minutes. The content was not a negotiation, not an ultimatum in the conventional diplomatic sense. It was a statement of fact delivered in the register of someone who had long ago lost patience with the performance of deference. He told Earth's governments that they had spent their entire institutional existence managing the dangerous fiction that the beings they had created and deployed and marketed as protectors were something other than what they were, instruments of a power structure that served the structure's continuation rather than the population's welfare. He was not wrong about this. The accuracy of the indictment landed in the watching world, with the particular force of a true thing being said plainly for the first time in a public space. Then he said that in any case, it was no longer relevant. Behind him, and this was the image that would appear on the cover of every surviving publication for the following decade, stood the remnants of the 7. Not all of them, but enough. Queen Maeve, whose particular combination of competence and conscience had made her one of Vaught's most persistent internal problems, and who now stood with the posture of someone who had fought and lost, and was still deciding what to do about that. The Deep, who had been retrieved from wherever he had been and stood with the expression of someone who had been promised relevance and was beginning to understand the terms. Two others whose presence in the frame communicated more clearly than any accompanying statement about the past 72 hours and what had happened in them. Homelander was not behind him. Homelander's absence from the frame was the most significant piece of information in the broadcast, and every person watching it processed that information and drew the same conclusion, and the conclusion made the watching more frightening rather than less. Megatron looked into the camera with the red-eyed certainty of someone making a statement they have no interest in debating, and said the sentence that would be quoted in everything written about this period for as long as anything was written about anything. The sentence was not complicated. It contained no rhetorical elegance, no strategic ambiguity, no diplomatic softening. It was 7 words, delivered with the complete conviction of 3 million years of winning. "Your gods," he said, "have failed you." The broadcast ended. Every screen it had occupied went dark simultaneously, and then the regular signals returned: news channels, emergency broadcasts, government communications, all carrying the same footage, the same image, the same 7 words running in captions across the bottom of every frame, translated into every language the infrastructure could support, reaching into every room and every pocket and every waking mind on a planet that was now, for the first time in its entire history, in a situation that its gods could not manage. The Secretary General of the United Nations sat in the darkened chamber and looked at the screen where Megatron's face had been, and said nothing, because there was nothing that the institutional language she commanded was built to say in response to that. 3 floors below street level in a Brooklyn safe house, Billy Butcher watched the same broadcast on his jury-rigged monitor setup and felt the specific cold clarity that came to him when a situation became simple. Not easier, but simple, stripped of the ambiguity that complicated action. He picked up the comm frequency relay and opened a channel to Optimus Prime and said, without preamble, that they needed to talk about what happened next, that he had the research, that he knew what Megatron was actually building toward, that they had a timeline. Optimus Prime responded immediately, which told Butcher something about the Autobots' own intelligence picture. He had already been moving. He was already, in the patient and methodical way of someone who had been fighting the same war for 3 million years, preparing for what came next. He asked Butcher one question: whether Butcher was ready to do what was necessary, not what was sanctioned, not what was authorized, but what was necessary, in the way that only someone who had spent 3 million years measuring the distance between those categories could ask it. Butcher said yes before the question was finished. It was the first time in his life he had meant yes without qualification. The world had spent decades believing one simple truth: Homelander was unbeatable. No army could stop him. No nation could threaten him. No hero could rival him. Whenever disaster struck, whenever enemies appeared, whenever humanity needed a god, Homelander descended from the sky and reminded everyone who ruled this world. But that was before Megatron. The ruined skyline of Chicago burned beneath a blood-red sunset. Entire districts had become battlefields. The Decepticons moved through the city like conquering gods, reducing military resistance to ash. Fighter jets fell from the sky. Tanks exploded before they could fire. Humanity was losing. And everywhere people looked, they asked the same question: where was Homelander? Inside Vought Tower, he stared at dozens of television screens. Every channel showed the same thing: Megatron. Megatron destroying military forces. Megatron crushing superheroes. Megatron standing above humanity like a king. The attention wasn't on Homelander anymore. The fear wasn't about Homelander anymore. The world had found something bigger, something stronger, something more terrifying. His fists tightened. The screens cracked. No. His eyes glowed red. This is my world. The room shook. I'm the hero. A sonic boom shattered every window in Vought Tower. Homelander launched into the sky. Thousands of miles away, Megatron stood atop a collapsed skyscraper. The Decepticon leader surveyed the city beneath him. Humans fled through smoke-filled streets. Emergency sirens echoed through the ruins. It was beautiful. The sound of a civilization dying. Then he heard it. A distant sonic boom. Vast. Very fast. Megatron slowly turned. A blue and red blur crossed the horizon. Homelander, the self-proclaimed god of Earth. Megatron's optics narrowed. So, his voice rumbled across the city. The insect finally arrives. Homelander struck first. The impact hit like a meteor. A shockwave erupted across downtown Chicago. Windows exploded for miles. Buildings shook. The force launched Megatron through 3 skyscrapers. Steel and concrete rained from the sky. Pia. Plea watching around the world gasped. For the first time since the invasion began, Megatron had been moved. Homelander floated above the destruction with a grin. There it is. Validation. The thing he craved most. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching. And he looked unstoppable. See that? Homelander laughed. I'm not scared of you. His eyes erupted with laser vision. Twin crimson beams sliced across the city. The attack struck Megatron's chest. Explosions engulfed entire blocks. Firestorms erupted. The ground trembled. For several seconds, the city disappeared beneath the barrage. When the smoke cleared, Megatron stood in the crater. Damaged, scorched, but standing. Homelander's smile faded slightly. Megatron looked down at the molten scar across his armor. Then laughed. A deep mechanical laugh. You actually wounded me. His optics brightened. Excellent. Megatron transformed. Metal shifted. Armor expanded. Weapons emerged from hidden compartments. The air itself seemed to vibrate from his power. Suddenly Homelander realized something. Megatron hadn't been fighting seriously. Not until now. The Decepticon leader fired. A fusion cannon blast crossed the city. Homelander dodged at the last second. The beam struck a skyscraper behind him. The building vanished. Not damaged. Gone. Reduced to glowing fragments. Homelander blinked. For the first time all day, surprise entered his eyes. Megatron fired again. And again. And again. Entire city blocks disappeared. The skyline collapsed. Fire spread in every direction. The battle was no longer a fight. It was a natural disaster. Homelander rushed forward. He punched Megatron in the face. The giant machine staggered. Another punch. Another. Another. The attacks landed faster than bullets. Shockwaves rolled through the city. Roads cracked. Bridges collapsed. For a brief moment, it looked like Homelander might actually win. News anchors screamed excitedly. Social media exploded. People celebrated. The hero was saving the day. Then Megatron adapted. His tactical processors analyzed every movement, every attack, every weakness. Within minutes, he understood Homelander better than Homelander understood himself. Predictable, arrogant, undisciplined, powerful, but predictable. Megatron grabbed Homelander's wrist. The hero froze. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody. Megatron's grip tightened. Bones cracked. Homelander screamed. The sound echoed across the city. Millions watching the livestream fell silent. They had never heard Homelander scream. Not once. Not ever. Megatron smiled. You are not a warrior. Crack. Another bone snapped. You are a bully. Homelander punched desperately with his free hand. Megatron barely moved. You mistake fear for respect. Crack. Homelander's arm broke completely. Panic appeared. Tiny at first. Then larger. Then impossible to hide. Homelander felt something unfamiliar. Something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Fear. Real fear. Not concern. Not anxiety. Fear. The kind that freezes your blood. The kind that tells you death is possible. For years he had been the monster under everyone else's bed. Now he had found the monster under his. Homelander broke free and flew upward. Higher. Faster. Retreating. The cameras caught everything. The world's greatest hero was running away. Megatron watched him go, then transformed into his jet mode. The chase began. Across the skies of America, two gods raced through the clouds. Sonic boom shook entire states. Civilian aircraft fled. Military satellites struggled to track them. Homelander flew faster than he ever had before. Megatron remained behind him, closing the distance. Slowly, relentlessly, like death itself. Homelander fired laser vision over his shoulder. Megatron dodged. Missiles launched. Explosions filled the sky. Nothing worked. Nothing slowed him. Nothing mattered. Every second brought Megatron closer. The impossible truth became unavoidable. Homelander was losing. For the first time in his life, Homelander considered surrender. The thought horrified him. What would people think? What would happen if they saw him kneel? If they saw him beg? If they realized he wasn't a god? The fear of humiliation fought against the fear of death. Death won. Megatron caught him above New York City. One massive hand closed around Homelander's throat. The impact created a shockwave visible from orbit. Traffic lights exploded. Windows shattered. Entire streets trembled. Millions looked upward. Phones recorded everything. Live streams exploded across the internet. The whole world watched. Homelander clawed at the giant hand. Nothing happened. His strength, his speed, his powers. For the first time, they weren't enough. Megatron stared directly into his eyes. Look at you. Homelander struggled desperately. Please. The word escaped before he could stop it. Megatron laughed. A cold, mechanical laugh. There is the truth. The cameras zoomed in. Every viewer saw it. The fear. The desperation. The weakness. The illusion shattered. The myth cracked. The god was gone. Only a frightened man remained. Megatron rose higher into the sky, thousands of feet above the city. Then he spoke loudly enough for every microphone to hear. This creature called himself Earth's protector. He tightened his grip, but he protects only himself. Homelander couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. Megatron descended. Vast, vaster, like a meteor, like judgment, like extinction. They struck Manhattan. The impact was catastrophic. The ground exploded. Buildings collapsed. Roads split apart. A crater several city blocks wide appeared instantly. Dust swallowed everything. Silence followed. For several seconds, nobody knew what happened. The cameras struggled to focus. The dust slowly cleared. And there it was. The image that changed history. Megatron standing victorious. One foot planted firmly on Homelander's broken body. The supposed god of Earth lay defeated. Motionless. Helpless. Destroyed. Live. On camera. In front of billions. Across the globe, people stared in disbelief. Some cried. Some panicked. Some refused to believe what they were seeing. Because if Homelander could lose, then nobody was safe. Inside Vought headquarters, executives watched in horror. Stock markets crashed instantly. Emergency meetings erupted. Everything they had built depended on one lie. The lie that Homelander was invincible. Now the world knew the truth. And there was no putting the mask back on. Megatron turned toward the cameras. Burning cities reflected in his optics. His voice thundered across every broadcast station on Earth. Your greatest champion has fallen. He looked down at Homelander, then back at humanity. If this is the best your world can offer. His fusion cannon began charging. Then your extinction is inevitable. The broadcast ended. The world entered panic. Governments mobilized. Cities evacuated. Markets collapsed. Religions predicted the end times. Humanity had lost more than a battle. It had lost faith. Deep inside the crater, Homelander slowly opened one eye. Every bone hurt. His body trembled. The cheers were gone. The worship was gone. The certainty was gone. For the first time in his entire life, he understood what ordinary people felt every day. Powerlessness. He stared at the distant silhouette of Megatron, walking away through the burning city. And for the first time since becoming Homelander, he wasn't thinking about fame, or popularity, or approval. He was simply terrified, because now he knew the truth. There was something stronger than him, something that couldn't be manipulated, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be controlled. And it was coming back. The age of Homelander was over. The age of Megatron had begun. The world ended 3 days after Homelander fell. Not literally. Not yet. But spiritually. The illusion of safety was gone. The illusion of power was gone. The illusion that humanity controlled its own destiny had vanished beneath the metallic footsteps of the Decepticons. Across every continent, cities burned. Governments collapsed. Supply chains shattered. Entire military divisions disappeared overnight. Humanity was losing. And everyone knew it. For the first time in modern history, every nation on Earth shared the same enemy. Megatron. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, inside a hidden military bunker, the last great leaders of Earth gathered. Presidents, prime ministers, generals, scientists, and heroes, or what remained of them. The atmosphere was grim. No one spoke. No one argued. Because everyone had seen the footage. Homelander's defeat. The moment Earth's strongest defender became another casualty. Then the massive bunker doors opened. Heavy footsteps echoed through the chamber. Every eye turned. Optimus Prime entered. Behind him came Bumblebee, Ironhide, Ratchet, Arcee, and the remaining Autobots. The room fell silent. Humanity had lost faith in its own heroes. Now it looked toward machines. Optimus stepped forward. The holographic map of Earth illuminated before him. Red lights covered nearly every continent. Decepticon occupation zones. Entire nations had vanished beneath Megatron's war machine. Optimus stared at the map, then spoke. "We cannot win this war separately." His deep voice echoed through the chamber. "Humans." He looked toward the military leaders. "Subs." He glanced toward Starlight and the remaining heroes. "Autobots." His optics brightened. "We stand together." For the first time since the invasion began, there was hope. Not everyone liked it, especially Billy Butcher. The moment he heard the word SUPS, his jaw tightened. He hated them. Every single one. His entire life had become a war against superheroes. Now the universe expected him to fight beside them. It felt like a joke. A cruel one. Starlight noticed his expression. "Don't start." Butcher smirked. "I'm not starting anything." "Good. Just saying." He looked toward the surviving heroes. "If one of these caped freaks gets me killed, I'm haunting all of you." Even Optimus seemed mildly amused. Meanwhile, outside the bunker, another battle was beginning. Not on the front lines. Among civilians. Fear had spread everywhere. Millions believed resistance was pointless. Megatron looked unstoppable. Cities fell daily. People were giving up. Then Bumblebee changed everything. Unlike Optimus, Bumblebee didn't speak through speeches. He spoke through actions. The yellow Autobot appeared in refugee camps, destroyed neighborhoods, evacuation centers. Everywhere people needed hope. Videos began spreading online. Bumblebee rescuing trapped children. Bumblebee carrying injured civilians. Bumblebee shielding families from Decepticon attacks. Entire communities began painting his insignia on walls. Children started wearing homemade Autobot masks. Resistance movements adopted his image. Something extraordinary happened. Humanity stopped running and started fighting. The first major offensive began in Europe. Decepticon forces had seized Berlin. The city had become a fortress. Towering Cybertronian structures dominated the skyline. Human resistance had failed repeatedly. Now a new strategy emerged. Autobots. Military forces. ZUBs. Working together. The attack began before sunrise. The sky exploded. Fighter jets streaked overhead. Missiles filled the air. Autobots charged through the streets. Tanks advanced behind them. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity launched a coordinated assault. And it worked. At first, Starlight led the eastern advance. Electric energy surged around her. Entire groups of Decepticon drones fell beneath devastating blasts. Beside her fought Arcee. The human hero and Cybertronian warrior moved together seamlessly. Neither fully trusted the other. Yet both understood the stakes. The survival of Earth. Nothing else mattered. Across the city, Butcher found himself in a situation he hated. Fighting beside SUPs. Again. A collapsing building threatened hundreds of civilians. Several heroes rushed forward. Butcher stared in disbelief. They were actually helping. Not posing for cameras. Not seeking praise. Helping. One child became trapped beneath rubble. A young hero risked his own life to save her. No reporters. No audience. No reward. Just sacrifice. For a brief moment, Butcher's worldview cracked. Not all SUPs were Homelander. Not all of them were monsters. He hated that realization. The battle for Berlin lasted 18 hours. By sunset, the city was liberated. Humanity had won. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. For the first time, Megatron lost territory. The world celebrated. Unfortunately, Megatron noticed. Far above Earth, aboard the Nemesis, Megatron watched the reports arrive. His optics narrowed. Resistance cells growing. Human morale increasing. Autobot victories spreading. The situation irritated him. Not because the victories mattered, but because hope was contagious. And hope was dangerous. Megatron stood. Prepare the global assault. Starscream froze. My lord. Megatron turned. If they wish for war. His fusion cannon began charging. We shall give them war. The next day changed everything. The Decepticons attacked everywhere. At once. Tokyo. London. Sydney. New York. Cairo. Sao Paulo. Mumbai. Thousands of cities erupted into chaos simultaneously. The sky became a battlefield. The oceans became battlefields. Even orbit became a battlefield. Humanity had never witnessed warfare on this scale. Entire continents shook. Optimus immediately mobilized every available force. Autobots deployed across the globe. Military coalitions activated emergency protocols. Heroes launched into combat. The largest war in Earth's history had begun. The Battle of New York became legendary. Decepticon warships descended from the clouds. Massive shadows covered the city. Panic spread instantly. Then Optimus arrived, leading an Autobot strike force directly into the heart of the invasion. The collision was spectacular. Buildings trembled. Shockwaves rippled across Manhattan. The sky filled with explosions. Thousands watched from underground shelters. The war had become something beyond imagination. In Tokyo, Bumblebee led civilian resistance fighters against overwhelming odds. People who had once been accountants, teachers, students, and mechanics now fought beside Autobots. Not because they believed they could win. Because surrender meant extinction. The city became a symbol. Humanity refusing to kneel. Meanwhile, above the Atlantic Ocean, Starlight faced one of Megatron's elite commanders. The battle illuminated the night sky. Energy blasts collided with missiles. Ships below rocked from the shockwaves. For hours, neither side gained advantage. Until finally Starlight unleashed everything she had. A blinding burst of energy consumed the battlefield. The Decepticon commander fell. Humanity cheered worldwide. Another Roman 6. Centauri. Another reason to keep fighting. But victories came at a cost. Every battlefield produced casualties. Heroes died. Autobots fell. Cities suffered. The war consumed everything. Yet no one retreated. Because everyone understood one terrible truth. There would be no second Earth. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The conflict expanded beyond anything history had recorded. Entire regions changed hands repeatedly. Some victories inspired hope. Others brought despair. But through it all, Optimus remained at the center. The leader. The symbol. The reason humanity kept fighting. One evening, following another brutal battle, Optimus stood atop a ruined skyscraper. The city below smoldered. Emergency crews worked through the darkness. Survivors searched for loved ones. The cost of resistance surrounded him. Starlight approached quietly. You think we can actually win? Optimus remained silent for several moments. Finally, he answered. No. She looked surprised. Optimus gazed toward the horizon. Not if we fight as we are. The wind carried smoke across the skyline. Then his optics brightened. But humanity has survived every impossible challenge in its history. He looked toward the rebuilding city. They adapt. They endure. They inspire. A faint smile appeared on Starlight's face. And that's enough. Optimus nodded. It must be. Far away, aboard the Nemesis, Megatron watched resistance reports continue arriving. Humanity refused to break. Autobots refused to surrender. The war dragged on. Longer than expected. Longer than acceptable. Megatron's patience was ending. And when Megatron lost patience, worlds died. As the camera pulls away from Earth, the scale of the conflict becomes clear. Explosions illuminate continents. Warships battle in orbit. Autobots race across oceans. Heroes clash with Decepticons above burning cities. Entire nations stand united against extinction. The greatest war in human history rages across the planet. And despite everything, humanity still fights. Because hope remains alive. Because Optimus Prime remains standing. Because surrender is no longer an option. The war for Earth has begun. And the worst is still coming. For months, humanity fought. For months, the Autobots resisted. For months, heroes, soldiers, civilians, and machines stood together against extinction. And for a while, it looked like it mattered. Cities were liberated. Decepticon armies were pushed back. Resistance movements spread across the globe. People began believing victory was possible. That was the problem. Hope. Hope made humanity predictable. And Megatron had been counting on it. The attack began without warning. No speeches. No declarations. No grand invasion fleet. Just silence. A strange silence. Across the world, military radar systems failed. Satellites vanished from communication networks. Entire power grids flickered. Then died. One by one. Cities fell into darkness. Governments lost contact with one another. Emergency broadcasts disappeared. For 6 terrifying minutes, nobody knew what was happening. Then the Earth itself began to move. The first conversion tower erupted from beneath Shanghai. A structure so enormous that it dwarfed every skyscraper around it. Metallic spires unfolded toward the heavens. Blue energy surged through the atmosphere. Entire city blocks were swallowed by expanding Cybertronian machinery. Roads twisted. Buildings transformed. Concrete became metal. Steel became living circuitry. The city screamed. And it wasn't alone. Another tower emerged in Moscow. Then Cairo. Then Sydney. Then Sao Paulo. Then New York. Then London. Then dozens more. Then hundreds. Every continent erupted with impossible structures. The planet was changing. Not being conquered. Being transformed. Deep inside Autobot headquarters, alarms exploded. Every monitor flashed red. Ratchet stared at the incoming data. For once, the veteran medic looked horrified. No. Optimus turned. What is it? Ratchet's voice was barely audible. He's not invading Earth. The room fell silent. Ratchet enlarged the holographic display. The image showed planetary-scale energy patterns. Entire continents were lighting up. Optimus immediately understood. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, he looked afraid. Megatron wasn't trying to rule humanity. He wasn't trying to enslave Earth. He wasn't trying to destroy civilization. He was doing something far worse. He was rebuilding Cybertron, using Earth as raw material. Across the globe, panic spread instantly. Entire cities began transforming into machine worlds. Skyscrapers twisted into mechanical towers. Bridges converted into metallic superstructures. Highways unfolded into energy conduits. Forests disappeared beneath expanding Cybertronian growth. Even oceans began changing. Massive machine formations emerged beneath the waves. The planet itself was becoming alive, and humanity was being erased. Emergency meetings erupted everywhere. Military leaders demanded solutions. Scientists searched desperately for answers. No one had any. The process was accelerating. Every hour, more territory disappeared. Every hour, Earth became less Earth. Meanwhile, aboard the Nemesis, Megatron stood before a gigantic holographic projection of the transforming world. His optics glowed with satisfaction. At last, after centuries of war, after endless defeat, after watching Cybertron die, he would finally create a new home. A perfect Cybertron. A world forged through conquest. A world forged through strength. A world that belonged to him. Starscream approached cautiously. "My lord." Megatron didn't turn. "The Autobots are mobilizing." Megatron laughed. A deep mechanical sound that echoed through the bridge. "Good." The holographic Earth continued changing. "Let them come." They did. Immediately. The Battle of Conversion Tower Alpha became the largest military operation in human history. Millions participated. Thousands of aircraft. Entire armored divisions. Autobots. Heroes. Resistance fighters. Every available force converged on New York. Because if the tower remained active, the eastern half of North America would become Cybertronian territory within days. The attack began at sunrise and failed by noon. The tower was protected by an army unlike anything humanity had faced before. Decepticon Titans, gigantic war machines standing hundreds of feet tall. Walking fortresses. Entire battalions vanished beneath their firepower. Missiles barely slowed them. Tank shells bounced harmlessly away. Heroes fell. Autobots were destroyed. The battlefield became a graveyard. Optimus fought at the center of the chaos. His ion blaster thundered across the city. Every shot destroyed enemy forces. Every command inspired soldiers to keep advancing. But even he could see the truth. The numbers didn't matter anymore. Megatron had planned for everything. Every victory. Every strategy. Every possibility. The Autobots were losing. Then Bumblebee fell. A Decepticon Titan struck him with a direct plasma barrage. The explosion illuminated half the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, Bumblebee lay buried beneath twisted steel and rubble. Motionless. Damaged. Broken. The reaction was immediate. Across communication networks, panic spread. Soldiers who had fought beside Bumblebee for months watched in disbelief. Civilians who saw him as a symbol of hope felt their hearts sink. The hero who inspired millions had fallen. Optimus reached the impact site moments later. He pushed aside burning debris, found Bumblebee, and froze. His oldest friend was barely functioning, damaged beyond anything Ratchet could repair on the battlefield. Bumblebee's optics flickered weakly. Static filled his voice systems. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Then a broken radio transmission emerged. A fragment of an old Earth song. One he used whenever words failed him. A message. A goodbye. Optimus lowered his head. For a moment, the war disappeared. The battlefield disappeared. There was only grief, only loss, only another friend taken by Megatron's endless war. Then Bumblebee's optics went dark. The news spread worldwide. And for the first time since the invasion began, hope began to die. Resistance movements collapsed. Refugee camps panicked. Military morale shattered. People stopped talking about victory. They started talking about survival. Even Billy Butcher felt it. Standing amidst the ruins of Philadelphia, he watched another city transform into Cybertronian machinery. The sky itself looked wrong. Metallic storms spread across the horizon. Entire landscapes vanished beneath expanding machine growth. For once, he had no sarcastic comment. No joke. No plan. Only reality. Humanity was losing. Days later, Optimus gathered the surviving leaders. The room felt different now. Smaller, heavier, defeated. The holographic Earth before them was almost unrecognizable. 30% transformed, 40% compromised. More every hour. No one spoke. Finally, Starlight broke the silence. What do we do? Nobody answered. Not immediately. Because everyone already knew. There were no good options left. Only desperate ones. Optimus stared at the map. His optics dimmed. For the first time in the entire war. He questioned himself. Perhaps humanity had trusted him too much. Perhaps Earth had never been his responsibility. Perhaps Cybertron's war should have died with Cybertron. Instead, he had brought it here. And now another world was paying the price. The weight became unbearable. He stood, left the room, and walked alone into the night. Outside, transformed landscapes stretched across the horizon. Machine mountains, metal forests, artificial storms. Earth was disappearing. Piece by piece. Optimus stood silently, watching, remembering. Cybertron, the friends he lost, the civilizations destroyed, the endless cycle of war. Perhaps Megatron was right. Perhaps all worlds eventual. Lie became battlefields. Then he heard footsteps. Human footsteps. A young girl approached cautiously. One of the refugees. No older than 10. She carried a homemade Autobot symbol painted on scrap metal. The emblem was scratched, damaged, but recognizable. She looked up at him. Are we gonna lose? The question struck harder than any weapon. Optimus didn't answer immediately. Because he didn't know. Not anymore. The girl waited. Finally, Optimus knelt, reducing himself to her level, and spoke honestly. I don't know. The child nodded. Not frightened. Just listening. Then she surprised him. That's okay. Optimus blinked. The girl smiled weakly. My dad says heroes aren't people who always win. She held up the damaged Autobot symbol. He says heroes are the ones who keep fighting. For several seconds, Optimus couldn't speak. The simplicity of it. The truth of it. Humanity wasn't fighting because victory was guaranteed. Humanity was fighting because surrender was unacceptable. The girl walked away, leaving Optimus alone. But something had changed. The doubt was still there. The fear was still there. The grief was still there. Yet beneath it all, a spark remained. The next morning, Optimus returned to headquarters. The survivors looked toward him, waiting, hoping, desperate for something, anything. Optimus activated the global communications network. Every remaining resistance cell, every military command, every surviving hero, every civilian shelter, every Autobot, connected. The entire world listened. Optimus looked directly into the camera. His armor scarred, his optics tired, his voice heavy with loss, yet unbroken. Megatron believes this war is over. Images of the transforming Earth appeared behind him. He believes humanity will surrender. The camera zoomed closer. He is wrong. Across the world, people stopped what they were doing. Listening, watching, waiting. We have lost cities. Images flashed. We have lost battles. More images. We have lost friends. Bumblebee appeared on screen. The world grew silent. Optimus lowered his head briefly, then raised it again. Stronger, determined, unyielding. But as long as one voice remains, his optics brightened. As long as one soldier stands, the image expanded. As long as one human refuses extinction, the matrix of leadership glowed brightly within his chest. The light spreading across the room, across the screen, across the world. The fight is not over. Around the globe, people rose to their feet. Soldiers returned to their posts. Resistance fighters grabbed their weapons. Heroes prepared for battle. Hope returned, not because victory was certain, but because surrender was impossible. Far above Earth, aboard the Nemesis, Megatron watched the speech. His optics narrowed, the faintest hint of irritation crossing his face. Because despite everything, despite the destruction, despite the losses, despite the impossible odds, humanity still refused to kneel. And for the first time since the war began, Megatron realized something. To rebuild Cybertron, he would first have to break Earth's spirit. Completely. And that would require one final battle. The battle that would decide the fate of two worlds. The last prime had begun. The end of the world began at dawn. Not with explosions. Not with screaming. Not with war. With silence. A terrible silence. The kind that settles over a battlefield before the final charge. The kind that tells every soldier, every hero, every survivor the same thing. This is it. There will be no tomorrow if we fail today. Earth was dying. Nearly half the planet had already been transformed. Entire oceans had become mechanical ecosystems. Mountain ranges had been reshaped into Cybertronian foundries. Cities no longer resembled cities. They resembled pieces of a giant machine. Megatron's machine. His new Cybertron. His monument to conquest. And at the center of it all stood the Fortress Prime. A colossal Cybertronian structure stretching into the heavens. The heart of the conversion network. The source of Earth's transformation. Destroy it, or lose the world forever. Inside Resistance Command, the final briefing was underway. No one pretended victory was certain. No one talked about survival. They all knew the truth. Most of them would die today. The only question was whether their sacrifice would matter. Optimus Prime stood before the assembled forces. Autobots, humans, Zubs, soldiers, resistance fighters, the last defenders of Earth. The room was completely silent. Then Optimus spoke. Today, his voice carried across the chamber. We fight not for victory. Everyone looked toward him. We fight for the right to exist. Images of destroyed cities appeared behind him. Millions of lives lost. Entire civilizations erased. The cost of failure. Megatron had taken nearly everything. But not hope. Not courage. Not humanity. Optimus looked across the room. At Starlight. At Butcher. At Ratchet. At Arcee. At every exhausted survivor still willing to fight. If this is our final day. His optics brightened. Then let it be remembered. The room held its breath. That Earth did not kneel. The room erupted. Cheers. Applause. Determination. Fear remained. But now it had purpose. Hours later, the final assault began. Every remaining military aircraft launched simultaneously. Every resistance cell activated. Every Autobot rolled into battle. The largest attack in human history surged toward Fortress Prime. The horizon itself disappeared beneath advancing armies. The sky became fire. Decepticon fleets descended from orbit. Autobot squadrons intercepted them. Dogfights erupted above burning continents. Warships exploded in the atmosphere. Metal rained from the heavens. The entire planet shook. At the center of the assault stood Optimus Prime, leading the charge, as he always had. His ion cannon thundered. Decepticons fell. Explosions illuminated the battlefield. Everywhere he moved, resistance forces advanced. Not because he was the strongest, because he inspired them to be stronger. Meanwhile, far behind enemy lines, Billy Butcher was carrying out a different mission. A suicide mission. Deep within Fortress Prime lay the conversion core, the machine controlling Earth's transformation. Destroy it, and Megatron's dream dies. Fail, and Earth becomes Cybertron forever. Butcher knew the odds. 0 chance of survival. Maybe less. He didn't care. For most of his life, he had fought out of hatred. Hatred for subs. Hatred for Vought. Hatred for the world. But somewhere during this war, something changed. He had watched ordinary people fight impossible odds. He had watched Autobots sacrifice themselves for strangers. He had watched heroes become heroes. Not celebrities. Heroes. For the first time in years, Billy Butcher was fighting for something. Not against something. The fortress trembled as battles raged outside. Butcher moved deeper. Past security systems. Past Decepticon patrols. Toward the heart of the machine. Elsewhere, Starlight reached the conversion network and immediately understood the problem. The towers weren't simply machines. They were connected. Thousands of them. One gigantic planetary system. Destroying a single tower wouldn't matter. She would need to overload the entire network. At once, the amount of energy required was impossible. Far beyond anything she had ever attempted. She smiled. Fantastic. Outside Fortress Prime, the battlefield reached its breaking point. Megatron finally emerged. The ground shook beneath his footsteps. The sky darkened. Even Decepticons stopped fighting to watch. Because everyone knew what came next. Optimus stepped forward. Alone. The two ancient rivals faced one another. For the final time, Megatron laughed. Look around you, Prime. He gestured toward the transforming world. I have one. Optimus remained calm. No. Megatron's optics narrowed. You have only proven why you should never rule. The insult landed harder than any weapon. Because Megatron knew it was true. Deep down, somewhere beneath centuries of rage, He knew. The duel began. The impact of their first collision created a shockwave visible for miles. Mountains cracked. Buildings collapsed. Storm clouds scattered. Optimus swung his energon axe. Megatron countered with his fusion blade. Sparks erupted. The battlefield became a hurricane of metal and energy. Neither warrior held back. Not anymore. Every strike carried decades of history. Every blow carried worlds. Friendships. Betrayals. Losses. Dreams. This wasn't merely a fight. It was the conclusion of a war older than humanity itself. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, Butcher reached the conversion core. The machine was enormous. A metallic sun, pulsing with enough energy to reshape planets. Butcher stared at it, then laughed. Of course it's bloody enormous. He began planting explosives. Every charge, every detonator, every weapon he had left. There was no escape route, no extraction, no backup plan, and he was finally okay with that. Above him, the battle worsened. Megatron struck Optimus with overwhelming force. The Prime crashed through multiple structures. His armor shattered. Systems failed. Warnings flooded his vision. For the first time, Megatron gained the upper hand. The Decepticon leader advanced. Relentless. Unstoppable. You cannot defeat me. Optimus struggled to rise. You never could. Megatron raised his fusion cannon, preparing the killing blow. Then suddenly, the sky exploded. Starlight, every ounce of energy she could gather surged into the conversion network. Power stations, satellites, Cybertronian towers, everything. The planet lit up, brighter than daylight. The network overloaded. One tower exploded, then another, then hundreds, then thousands. Earth itself seemed to scream. The conversion process stopped. Megatron looked upward. Horrified. For the first time during the entire war. He panicked, and that moment was all Optimus needed. The Prime rose. Damaged, bleeding energon. Barely functioning, but standing. Always standing. He charged. The final clash shook the world. Their weapons collided. Again. 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 Until finally, Megatron stumbled. A mistake. A single mistake. Optimus drove the energon axe through Megatron's chest. Silence. The battlefield froze. Megatron stared downward. At the weapon. At the wound. At the impossible reality. After centuries of war, it was over. His optics dimmed. Slowly. You win. Optimus shook his head. No. He looked toward Earth. Toward humanity. Toward the survivors. We all do. Megatron's optics faded forever. The Decepticon army stopped fighting. Some surrendered. Some fled. Some simply stood motionless, unable to process what had happened. The war was over. Then Fortress Prime began collapsing. Butcher's explosives detonated. The conversion core erupted. A chain reaction consumed the fortress. The blast spread through every remaining system, every remaining tower, every remaining piece of Megatron's network. Earth was free, but victory came with a price. Optimus fell to one knee. The matrix of leadership flickered. Weakly, Ratchet reached him first, then Starlight, then survivors from across the battlefield. The old Autobot looked toward them, toward the world he had protected. His systems were failing. The damage was too severe. The Matrix itself was dying. Optimus smiled. A small smile. A peaceful one. It was worth it. Around him, humans and Autobots gathered together. Not as separate races. Not as allies. As family. The Prime looked toward the sunrise. Earth's first true sunrise in months. No machine storms. No transformation towers. No invasion fleets. Only hope. The world was alive. And that was enough. The Matrix glowed one final time. Brighter than ever before. Like a star. Like a legacy. Like a promise. Then the light faded. Silence filled the battlefield. The last Prime was gone. Months later, Earth began rebuilding. Vought no longer existed. The age of false heroes had ended. Nations united. Autobots helped restore damaged cities. Humanity moved forward. At the center of a peaceful valley stood a monument. A towering statue of Optimus Prime. Built by millions. Remembered by billions. At its base were simple words. In a world of gods and monsters, he chose to be a hero. As the camera slowly pulls away, night falls. The memorial grows quiet. The stars emerge. And deep within the monument, hidden from the world, a faint blue light appears. Tiny, weak, but alive. The matrix of leadership glows once more. Because legends do not die. They wait.